I'm from Laughing My Arts Off and I'm based in Lake Macquarie. Today, as part of Newcastle Libraries and Library Information Week 2020, I will be demonstrating the process to make magical mandalas. So what is a magical mandala? It is a slow stitching, embroidery and application process that you use with scrap fabrics, beads, buttons and little trinkets. Mandalas are part of Buddhism. They're used to help you focus your mind, to help you meditate. Mandalas normally are created with either sand or paint, but slow stitching works just as well because it keeps your fingers busy and your mind focused. The most important thing with these magical mandalas is that you find a quiet space. A nice sunny spot in your house is usually great, or next to a fireside, as long as you've got good lighting. And slowly take your time experimenting with your stitches. I have provided a PDF of instructions, and within that you will find a Feng Shui chart. It has a number of different areas of your life to focus on if you really want to use your mandalas to help you figure out meaning in your life or to figure out any solutions to problems you might have. So there is prosperity, family, love, relationships, work, career, health, etc. That's only there if you want to use that as a guide, but you don't have to. I just find that it might be helpful in the future. So what you will need for your mandala is an embroidery hoop, needle, stranded thread, regular thread, fabric scissors, very fancy, and scraps of fabric. Old clothes are great, old bed sheets are fantastic. You can put the mandalas directly onto an old shirt if you really want to, but I like to just use scraps, and that way you can transport them if you need to. Beads and old buttons are great as well, little bits of ribbon. You can use that all later. And if you don't think you have the dexterity to sew, which trust me you do, we can figure it out. But if you don't have the dexterity to sew, use glue. It works just as well. The first things you need to know about mandalas is that they come in 3 parts. The center, the inner circle and the outer circle. And the reason it's made into 3 parts is for you to help focus your mind. The center is supposed to be you. The inner circle is your thoughts and the outer circle is the outside world. If you're not using a mandala to help you meditate, that's fine. The center is where you put pretty things, the inner circle is where you put all the details, and the outer circle is the big bit. It's very simple. So to get started on mandala, get a piece of plain fabric. It can be any fabric. I've cut this out of an old shirt. Plain is best. Don't use stretch when putting it into the embroidery hoop because it can warp a little bit, but you can use stretch fabrics as scraps. Felt is also a great fabric to use as a base, especially for younger hands. So put your fabric in the embroidery hoop and pull it tight, like a drum. Next, get an old shirt or a larger piece of fabric that you have. As you can see, this is an old dress, and cut out a circle, which I have done. Don't be too fancy about it. As you can see, it doesn't fit. We want to make sure that we can create a good shape that'll fit inside our embroidery hoop. You can do any shape you want. A circle, a square, lots of triangles. I like to just fold my circle into an ice cream cone shape and then cut the edges, similar to how you would make a paper snowflake if you've ever made those before. So I'll just cut some random edges, and that should be our outer circle, which is sort of looking like a square, which is cool. Now you can use pins to pin the fabric down as you go, or if you have actually ironed your fabric or are using a heavier fabric like felt, it'll probably stay there by itself, so it's not important. The next step is to do some shapes for the inner circle. You really only need really small amounts of fabric. You don't need huge amounts. You can colour coordinate as you wish. As I say, felt is really good because it's easy to cut and easy to stitch. So I might just do some little squares. Now, if you fold the fabric and cut, you'll get the same shape multiplied, or you can draw onto your fabric with a pen or a pencil and cut around those shapes. Alternatively, you can draw up your shapes on a bit of paper, cut it out and use it as a template. But since they're such small shapes, it's probably easier to just fold it and cut it. The secret to a mandala, especially in sewing or any mandala really, is repetition. So make lots and lots of the same shape. In terms of these fabric mandalas, I don't use lots and lots of fabric because I do all of the complication detail in stitching, which we'll do in a minute. So just as you cut out your fabrics, lay them down until you find a pattern and a shape that's right for you. So the next step is stitching and embroidery. So I'm going to show you some embroidery stitches so that you can have a few to rely on and then use as you go. So the first thing you need is stranded thread. This is an embroidery thread. You can buy these from any sort of craft shop. You don't want to cut too much of a length. I say 1 meter, which is about nose to the tip of your finger. Then you can split the thread. We'll have 6 strands. And what you want to do is pull 1 strand out at a time, because the strands will then re-twirl back together once you're done and you're less likely to get a knot. 2 strands is optimal because it's stronger than 1, but you can also use up to 6 strands if you want a thicker look with your embroidery. Experiment with it, try it out. Mandalas are great in the fact that you can always undo it, you can unpick it if you don't want to, or just keep going and make more of it, because repetition is key. So these are my 2 strands. I'll just put them into the needle very quickly. Once you have your needle threaded, which may take some time, tie a knot in the end of your thread and we will start with the first type of stitch. This is called a running stitch. We'll follow the shapes. You don't have to draw onto your fabric to sew. This is just as a guide for you now. So pull the needle all the way through, put it down, makes a stitch. Basic. Leave a gap, and we're off and running, which is why it's called a running stitch. The next stitch we're going to do is called a backward stitch, because we're going to go backwards. Just like the running stitch, we start, we make a stitch forward. This time we come up, and instead of making a running stitch, we go back to the same hole that we just left off. This is a back stitch. Pretty simple, great for doing straight lines. The next one, it's called a stem stitch. So it's similar to a back stitch. So we start with our running stitch, we come up, but instead of going through the same hole, we'll go next to, usually about halfway down the first stitch. This will actually make it appear a much thicker line without having to waste too much thread. And that is a stem stitch, which is great. The next stitch we're going to do is called a chain stitch. So, needle through and needle back through the same hole. We're going to leave a big loop. We'll bring the needle back up, but we want the needle to go through the loop. Then you can pull it tight. Put the needle back through the same hole and repeat. This will give you a very fancy looking stitch without that much effort. creates a wonderful chain effect. Of course, there's all sorts of types of embroidery stitches. These are your basics. I think the only other one we'll do is a blanket stitch, but we really need fabric for that one, and I'll show you how to do that one in a minute. The only other type of stitch is called a seed stitch. This is the best one. It's really simple. Just go up and down randomly. I can do it without even looking. Oh, how great. Let's just keep doing that. And that is the joy of seed stitch, or stitching in general, because you don't even have to look. Having said that, I should put in a safety warning. Safety warning! Don't prick your fingers. If you have a problem with it, use a thimble. So now we're going to start the stitching on our mandala. I have created an odd, not quite circular shape for the centre. Your shapes don't have to be a perfect shape, they could just be a random shape. Now, remember to put a knot in the end of your thread and come up through the bottom. This last stitch I didn't show you before because you need the edge of the fabric. It is called a blanket stitch. So we come up through both layers of the fabric, the base, the outer circle and the centre. We take a stitch across as if we're about to do a running stitch. But we're going to leave a big loop like the chain stitch. We're going to come up to the other side to the edge of our centerpiece and put the loop over our needle and pull it tight. It's a chain stitch but over the edge. So as we work our way around, we will end up keeping this piece of fabric and the edges stitched down. Now you don't have to use this stitch, you could use any of the stitches to put any of these bits of fabric onto your mandala. You can use the stitches to create circles, to create flowers, to create lines, to create other shapes, to stitch down more bits of fabric or to stitch down buttons. And if you are using the mandala to figure out problems in your life and to help you meditate, as you make and focus on your issue, as you sit and make your mandala, those thoughts will come back to you every time you look at your mandala. And with these mandalas, what are you going to do with it afterwards? You could stitch it onto a denim jacket, you could turn them into some cushions, you could stitch them together and make a wall hanging. There's a million possibilities. But it's simple enough for anyone to be able to do. So this is my blanket stitch working its way around the edge. But here's one I prepared earlier. I've started putting the blanket stitches around the outside of these big circles. The star in the centre, I've just done a running stitch, or what is actually known as a slip stitch. It goes the other way, but it's the same principle. So I've got these other shapes that are really small and I can pin them on as I have done, but I'm afraid I might prick myself as I start embroidering. So what we're going to do is we're going to baste them on. And to do that, you just need your regular thread, not your stranded cotton. You do not put a knot in the end, and make sure that it's only one thread thick. From here, we just do our running stitch across the surface of our design, and this will keep all of these smaller pieces in place while we spend time doing our embroidery. Make sure they're really big stitches. So once you've basted your smaller details and you've started doing your embroidery, maybe you want to put in some additional details. So I would like to put some rays in. So I'm just going to do some stitching. This is going to be a stem stitch, and this will just create a line to extend my mandala past the scraps of fabric. The reason I use scraps of fabric and the reason I use old clothes is we want to recycle, upcycle what we can, and the smallest bit of fabric can still turn into something beautiful. The secret to keeping your fabric on the mandala is to make sure that you at least stitch through all layers of the fabric. but just a simple cross can keep that small piece in place. It doesn't have to be really intricate stitching around the outside. And once you're done, you can also sew on some buttons, some bits of ribbon. These I've created as little flowers so that they have a bit of texture. And you can also use some paint to emphasize any bits that you would like to. And that is how you make a magical mandala. I hope you enjoyed the process. I hope you make lots of them. Please take a photo of your creation and put it on social media and tag us as well as the Newcastle Libraries. You can also find out more details about the classes at Laughing My Arts Off at laughingmyartsoff.com.au. Thank you very much.